So, Justice Tanzer, thank you for meeting with us. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we are honored to meet with you given your historic work in advancing civil rights in Mississippi during the 1960s and the height of the civil rights movement. You wrote an article about your experience in Mississippi, and it's called 1964, My Story of Life and Death in Mississippi. And in this article, you describe your experience as an attorney with the organized crime and racketeering section of Robert Kennedy's Justice Department beginning in 1962. Your experiences included serving as a volunteer marshal during the 1963 March on Washington, where you heard Martin Luther King's historic I Have a Dream speech, and you served as the prosecutor for the grand jury that indicted people responsible for violating the civil rights of Freedom Summer volunteers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andy Goodman, who were murdered for organizing a campaign to register black voters in Neshoba County, Mississippi.
Yes.
And these indictments, I understand, were the first civil rights criminal conspiracy indictments ever, a historic moment indicating that the U.S. government would no longer permit states to use law enforcement officials to suppress black citizens.
That's my understanding. I've been told there have been some prosecutions under the statute, but that's vague memory.
Mm-hmm.
There are no records of it in the department, and it is the first for conspiracy to do so.
Well, congratulations, and thank you deeply for your service to our country. That was a very historic moment because it turned the tide and led to ultimately the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which we'll talk more about. And I want to tell you that your memoir is deeply moving and a vivid reminder of the horrors of the past and the sacrifices made to advance freedom and democracy. So thank you for helping with that effort.
I'm happy that it's appreciated.
My first question is in regards to your memoir. I'm quoting something that you said in your memoir. You said, quote, "The end of Jim Crow, slow and painful as it was, and the integration of black people into the mainstream of American life was, to my mind, and continues to be, the greatest social revolution ever, anywhere." Will you please share your thoughts with us regarding this observation?
Well, I made it from the point of view of an American who observes groups being integrated into the society as a whole. And black people were not the only group one could identify. And the Chinese, the Japanese, the Asians, they had a tough enough time coming into the society and finding full acceptance, which I think today they have. But the blacks were not a voluntary immigrant group, as the Asians were, as my parents were. They were brought over for slavery, not for economic improvement, but for involuntary economic degradation, every kind of degradation. They were brought over to be slaves. And they lived for a couple centuries under the system of slavery. And for them, as a mass movement with some brilliant leadership, we happen to think of Martin Luther King most often, but there were people like Ralph Abernathy and others, John Lewis now, a congressman, and other really brilliant leaders, and some not so good leaders, have really come into the society generally. I don't think the Black Revolution is fully completed yet, but it's still going on. But at least statistically, I'm no expert, I'm no sociologist, but at least statistically we see that there's higher crime rates, their children, statistically, are not doing as well in schools, in their education. They're not making as much economically as white people. More of them are not than white people are not. So the true equalization, if, for lack of a better word, of black people as a race and as a group has not been completed. But on the other hand, when you see school kids walking down the street, today you can see kids in a group with different races. When I was a kid, you'd see black kids, you'd see white kids, you'd see Asian kids. Jewish kids were starting to come in, you know, but they were sometimes by themselves, sometimes not. But today you see kids in groups. You see more intermarriage, see more mixed race children. It means that they're coming in, they're part of America now in a way that they were not. But there's progress yet to be made. And so that's why I say, because they came all the way from a couple centuries of slavery and involuntary immigration here for slavery, and today they're free people, and so many of them successful free people in our larger society. That makes me think that the revolution has been successful, but it's not yet complete.
Thank you for that observation. In your memoir, you also noted that historian Crane Brinton stated that, quote, "Revolutions come from hope, not despair." In what way did hope influence your experiences working in Mississippi?
Well, let me put that in context a little bit. The 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation before it eliminated slavery, it abolished slavery, and then Lincoln, of course, was shot, and Reconstruction was really sabotaged by conservative elements in the Congress and by an unsympathetic President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon. And Jim Crow laws were passed, and slavery was essentially reinstated in the South, or maintained. There was still economic slavery. There was the social separation of slavery. There was still a master-servant relationship. It was really almost like slavery, except you couldn't buy and sell people. That was about the only difference. And that was maintained in the South. The North was, of course, much better, but even in the North, blacks were not given entirely their due. I don't think we should look only to the South. If you think about hope, the big change, was Brown versus Board of Education. And that was the first sign that the Supreme Court was going to put an end to this. And it gave more hope than was realized, because it was hard to enforce. All deliberate speed turned out to be all deliberate delay and massive resistance through the South. And then there came a time when the young people in North Carolina, as it happened, college kids they were dissatisfied at the pace of change, properly so. And they started the sit-ins. And the sit-ins had an appeal to Americans. One, it was on television, a new medium at that time. And two, respectable looking kids being roughed up by young toughs pouring ketchup on them, and just on what they thought, what the toughs thought were humiliating acts. And the kids retained their dignity, and their composure and the empathy of people. The empathy of the public was with them. And then the freedom rides, and then the displays of moving a few nice, neat, clean-looking black kids into schools with federal marshals and others leading them through hooting crowds. They're built a public momentum. They're built the sense that things are changing. And I think hope even in the South was there. Well, when Freedom Summer came on in the midst of all this, and don't forget, incidentally, the March on Washington, which you mentioned, that was in August 1963. Freedom Summer 1964 came, and there was an invasion, particularly of the Deep South, particularly of Mississippi, of sympathetic, trained college kids, white and black, that were saying, you're going to vote, and we're going to help you vote if you'll only work with us. Well, people had been murdered and shot, and arrested, tortured, harassed, etc. Black people were for trying to vote. There was a fellow in Greenwood or Greenville, I always mix them up, black man, not long before this, that went to the courthouse and picked up a copy of the application form to apply to vote. And that afternoon he was shotgunned to death. That was not uncommon. But all of a sudden there were all these elements. Public opinion was growing. There was a sense of activity. There was a sense of change. There was something going on. The Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party was organizing as an alternative to the white-dominated Democratic Party in Mississippi. Things were happening. And so hope was building. And with each stage of protest against the existing regimen, hope built. And the people I dealt with a year, 2 years before would have totally feared for their lives, and they still feared for their lives. But somehow they had the courage to come forward and to join in their way, the way they could, in the movement. And when I say the movement, by, among other things, helping us as federal prosecutors prosecute the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, which murders were ignored by local authorities as an everyday event.
May I follow up and ask why that case, the case you worked on in particular, was such a critical case in the civil rights movement?
Well, it was for many reasons. But I think Allard Lowenstein was right. He was a very well-known liberal progressive thinker of the day. He was later a congressman from Long Island, but he was active in organizing Freedom Summer, the movement of over 1,000 kids, mostly white, but black too, who went to Mississippi in the Freedom Project. And he observed, and he wasn't trying to be, it wasn't strategic thinking by any means, he didn't want it. But he said, you know, black people have been killed for decades, centuries, in fact, for demanding their rights in the South. Nothing occurred from it, nothing came of it. But, you know, if one of these white kids that we're sending down south to work on voting rights, if one of the white kids gets hurt, that's going to affect public opinion. That's going to have political force. That will push it over the top, so to speak. Well, Schwerner and Goodman were those white kids. They went missing on June 16, 1964. They were with the summer project. They had with them a trainee, Andy Goodman. And it was known that they were arrested. 3 people, 1 driver and 2 passengers, arrested for speeding. You ever hear of passengers arrested for speeding? And they were in jail. And it was known that they were released at 1:30 in the morning. And it was known that they hadn't shown up and they were missing. And every day, these were headlines. These were in Walter Cronkite's news in the evening. And the pressure built up. And meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, there had been a wave of off-year Republicans elected, but they were moderate Republicans, not today's Republicans. And they were sympathetic to civil rights. And LBJ, who had been stalled by the Southern dominance of the committees in the Senate, in his brilliant way, one by one, going to Hubert Humphrey and getting his help from the liberal side and telling Dick Russell of Georgia, you know, if you don't give them something, they're going to get more. If you resist, come on, you better support this. LBJ, in his way, knee to knee, senator by senator, gaining Senate approval, at the beginning of June 1964, which is just when Freedom Summer began. And then the 16th of June, these boys, young men, went missing. And they hadn't been found. I'm not sure just when they were found, but on July 2, when public opinion was at a high pitch, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 couldn't be stopped, and it was enacted. And then they were found, and then we went down with the grand jury. So that was the sequence. They were very interrelated because it was the swell of public opinion, finally, after this sequence of hopeful events that I had mentioned occurred, that really gave LBJ the strength to push that Civil Rights Act through.
Well, I just think that, in many ways their lives were not in vain, and they did not die in vain, that they were critical key figures, part of the many who sacrificed their lives to advance rights for others. So
the people who went down there, I had federal protection when I went, but the people who went down as volunteers and freedom rides or whatever, they were true heroes. I remember John Siegenthaler, when he came back from the freedom ride, and he'd been beaten to within an inch of his life, got out of the hospital. He was an observer for Robert Kennedy. I just happened to be in the AG's office. I wasn't typically there, but I was when he came back for his first visit out of the hospital and was greeted as a hero. Thank goodness you're back, John. It was very real.
So, since 1964, how far do you think we have come? And what challenges do we face to shape a better future?
We've come a long way. We've come a long way, but you asked me about the revolution. And I feel there has been a revolution. You know, where's the law firm without black lawyers, the large law firm without black lawyers? They're practicing law commonly, good lawyers, accepted in our profession. And that's true in other professions as well. You see middle-class blacks, professional blacks, they've become part of the American culture, the American society, the American economy, as they should be. But statistically, not yet in the numbers that we should aim for or regard as normal. So we've come a long way. And I have to say that whenever I see I'm repeating myself, whenever I see a couple of, or a group of high school kids, with black and white, and maybe Asian or Mexican together, I feel like we're a different country than we were when I was a kid. Heck, when I was a kid at Grant High School, class of '52, we had 2 black kids in that school. I mean, things are different now, and for the better.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is in 2012, for the first time in the United States, there were more children of color born than white children. And if you look at the demographic from 18 and younger, it's more than 50% children of color. So that's why you're seeing all these mixed.
They're coming, whether we want them or not.
Absolutely.
They're coming.
Absolutely. America's changing. There's a huge demographic shift that's going on right now.
But what I hope to see is the blend.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean homogenization. I mean, I come from a particular ethnic group. I'm happy to see many of the traditions of that group and values of that group upheld, but being an American is the dominant culture,
mm-hmm.
and I'm happy to see that.
Yeah. That's the thread that ties us all together. We're like a quilt or a stew in America now, is what some people say.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we used to talk about melting pot and the alloy. And today they talk about the fruit salad.
Right, absolutely.
I think that's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah, it is. So my last question is more philosophical, because you've lived a long life and you've accomplished many great things. And so I want you to, if you would care to share with us, any pearls of wisdom that you have about life.
Well, life is too big a subject for me. But if you want to talk about this, I've been thinking about it. And I think it goes back to something that I heard over and over and over back in the 60s, which was, you can't change how people think by law. You can't pass a statute which controls the way people think. A judge can't order people to think a certain way. And I think that's right. I truly do. But what I've now seen is the operation of the Civil Rights Act, and even more, the Voting Rights Act of '65. And I've been back to Mississippi quite a few times. My wife's family is from there. So I've been back. What I've seen is a completely different relationship in the normal, everyday activity of blacks and whites. There are still vestiges of segregation. There have to be from hundreds of years. But what law can do is to change conditions. And when a couple generations of kids grow up under a different normality, a different sense of what's the right way, then that does change how people think. It does change how people act. You know, it reminds me of a story I love to tell. This was told to me by a witness. Shortly after I was down there with the Lawyers Committee in '67, Pat Hurley, a great trial lawyer from Portland, I'll condense the story, but he went down with the Lawyers Committee. You may be aware that there were a lot of lawyers volunteering to go down to Mississippi, a lot of lawyers from Oregon. Pat was one of them. And he tried a wrongful death case where the Klan, for various reasons, it's a whole story, simply killed a random black man because the Negroes were getting too uppity. And they went out and shotgunned him. And there was no local prosecution. So the FBI cooperated, and the lawyers committee, which we volunteered with, brought a wrongful death suit. And Pat tried the case. He was a great lawyer, great trial lawyer, and later a judge, circuit judge. A witness told me that his argument to the jury was that the issue you have to decide in this case is, what is the value of a human life in Mississippi? And he says, your answer does not matter to me. I'll be on a plane to go home tomorrow to Portland, Oregon. The answer will matter to your children and your grandchildren and their grandchildren. That was right. You cannot, by law, force people to change their thinking, but you can change the conditions. You can change in the coming generations. And I thought that was perhaps the greatest jury argument I've ever heard of.
Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No.
Thank you very much, Justice Tanzer. We really appreciate your time.
I'm pleased that you did this. Thank you.